The moment my brother opened his mouth, I felt the familiar drop in my stomach, the warning that the night was about to turn against me just like it always did in this house. Still writing little content, he said, his voice slicing through the room loud enough for every person gathered around that long oak table to hear. Laughter burst out instantly, sharp, predictable, cruel in a way no one bothered to hide. Silverware clattered, crystal chimed, the chandelier trembled like it was reacting to the tension itself. And I stayed frozen in my chair, quiet, rigid, holding myself together the way someone holds the last piece of something fragile, pretending the sting in my chest was nothing more than a passing breath. But beneath that stillness, something in me pressed harder against the walls I'd built, something ready to break open. I should have known the evening would tilt the moment I pulled into my parents' driveway. Their house in Mapleton Ridge had always looked staged white pillars, perfect wreaths, the kind of place photographed for holiday catalogs. I'd never felt at home inside it, only examined. Inside, dinner had already turned into the usual performance voices, raised opinions launched like fireworks. Dad dominated the table, Mom orbited like a hostess at a charity gala, and my siblings thrived under the warm glow of being exactly what the family valued. Then there was me. I hadn't even reached for the cranberry sauce when Ethan leaned back and launched the same tired insult for the 5th holiday in a row, still writing little content. The table reacted with rehearsed delight. Even Aunt Linda hid her smile behind her napkin, failing miserably. I lifted my water glass. "I'm still writing," I said. "Writing," Jenna echoed. "People still get paid for that," Ethan chimed in. "Barely." More laughter. Mom brushed my wrist. "Honey, maybe it's time to think about something more secure. You're 32. We worry." Dad exhaled in that heavy, disappointed way of his. "Your siblings are moving up. You're drifting." If they only knew. 8 years building something that would terrify men like my father if he understood the scale. 8 years of acquisitions negotiations, silent chess moves, while they treated me like a child scribbling in the margins. I stayed quiet, letting the old script run its course. Allison stepped in next. "My firm needs people to write marketing blurbs. I could help." "I don't write blurbs," I said. She winked. "Not yet." Laughter again. Not even creative laughter, just the mean kind people fall back on when cruelty becomes tradition. Inside, something flared. Anger, maybe, or exhaustion, or simply the truth trying to surface. My phone buzzed in my pocket once, twice, then, on repeat. Dad shook his head. "Who needs you on Thanksgiving, Lauren? That's why those jobs don't last." I excused myself before the buzzing became more ammunition. In the quiet hallway, the shift hit me. 7 missed calls from my CFO, 4 from PR, 9 from legal, 1 from Eli Rothwell, the CEO I had just bought out. My pulse sharpened. I tapped Eli's name. He answered immediately. "Lauren, it's out. The journal published early." My breath caught. "How early?" 3 hours. You're the headline. They exposed the acquisition. They exposed you. You're everywhere." I closed my eyes. The $6.8 billion deal, my deal, the empire I built in silence. "And your family?" Eli asked. "They're about to find out." I hung up and opened the link. The headline glowed at me. A photograph taken years ago. My full name, the company I'd built from nothing, everything laid bare. Standing there in my parents' foyer, the silence cold under my heels, I felt something settle in me. Not fear. Don't panic, something steadier. They'd spent years assuming my apartment meant failure. They had built an entire narrative about me, one where long days meant failure, and my silence proved I had nothing going on. They had no idea what those hours had actually bought or what that quiet had been hiding. They couldn't have been more wrong. The truth was in front of me now, loud, undeniable, and the weight of their assumptions finally slid off my shoulders. I drew in a slow breath, let it settle in my chest, and turned back toward the dining room. When I turned back toward the dining room, there was nothing unsteady about me. My breath held firm, my pulse calm, a kind of clarity settling into my bones. The room I had always walked into as a disappointment was about to meet the version of me they'd never imagined. I wasn't walking in as the version of Lauren they'd always talked over. I was stepping back into that room, ready to let reality speak for itself, ready or not. I stepped back into the dining room just as another wave of laughter faded, the kind that always felt a beat too proud of itself. Plates clattered, chairs shifted, and for a moment no one even noticed I'd returned. They were still talking about me, of course they were, but now it was in that smug, careless tone people use when they assume the target isn't nearby. Then Dad looked up. His knife stopped mid-air. Mom's smile froze. Ethan's grin faltered, like someone cut the power behind it. It was the phones. Every single person at that table had one buzzing in their pocket, purse, or palm, notifications popping like tiny explosions. Heads lowered almost in sync screens, lighting their faces in cold white. And then, absolute silence. Jenna was the first to react. Her hand flew to her mouth, eyes huge breath catching audibly. "Oh my God! Lauren!" Ethan frowned at his screen confusion, folding into something sharper, something uncomfortable. This can't be real." Dad leaned in, squinting jaw tightening by degrees. "This is a mistake. Someone's playing a joke." But even he didn't sound convinced. Mom's phone dropped onto her plate, splashing gravy across the tablecloth. Her voice trembled. "Lauren, honey, what is this?" I took the empty seat I'd abandoned minutes earlier, the same seat they'd mocked me from, and folded my hands calmly on the table. "It's exactly what it looks like." Ethan blinked at me for once, unable to summon a single joke. "So you own this thing, Bishop. Media Group." He said the name like it was written in a foreign language. "I built it," I corrected, keeping my voice even. 8 years, quietly, intentionally. Allison shook her head so hard her earrings tapped against her neck. "No way. You live in a rented apartment." I met her stare. A convenience, not a limitation. Dad's gaze snapped up. "Why didn't you tell us? We could have helped you." "Helped?" The word landed with a sting, but I stayed composed. "You would have redirected me," I said, "told me to aim smaller, to make safer choices, to get a real job." "I didn't need that." Mom looked wounded. "We only wanted what was best for you." "Your version of best," I replied gently, "was never mine." Around us the atmosphere shifted like the room itself understood the dynamic had tilted and was trying to catch up. No one reached for their food anymore. No one joked. They were too busy recalibrating the person they thought they knew. Dad cleared his throat, the sound rigid. "This valuation. $6.8 billion. That can't be accurate. It's already on the markets," I said. After-hours trading pushed it higher. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. "So, you're some kind of CEO now?" I didn't bother answering. The news had done that for me. Jenna leaned in, whispering, like she was afraid the walls would hear. "Is this why you always disappeared early from holidays? Why did you never talk about work?" "Yes." "Is this why you were always on your phone?" "Yes." "Is this why Dad cut her off?" "Enough." He turned to me. "We deserve an explanation." The entitlement in his tone should have bothered me. It didn't. Not anymore. "You never listened when I tried to explain," I said, so I stopped trying. Ethan scoffed, reflex more than conviction. "Come on, Laure. If you were doing something like this, we would have noticed. You don't notice what you don't respect." His mouth snapped shut. Mom reached for my hand, then hesitated midair, as if unsure she still had permission to touch me. "We didn't know," she whispered. "We truly didn't." "I know," I said softly. "That was part of the problem." The room held its breath. Then Dad finally voiced what they were all thinking. Why hide it? The truth rose easily. Because I needed space to build something without being judged for every step I said. And because I knew none of you believed I could do anything meaningful with my life. Allison spoke up then, quieter than I'd ever heard her. We underestimated you." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The doorbell rang suddenly, one single sharp chime that broke the tension. Mom was startled. Who could that be? On Thanksgiving, Dad pushed his chair back, annoyance flickering again his default armor. He strode toward the hallway, but before he reached the door, I already knew what was happening. The press had found the house, not the paparazzi real reporters, financial press, network crews, people who had been trying to get an interview with the mystery media mogul for months. Dad froze at the sound of voices outside, journalists calling my name through the thick front door. Mom stood flustered. "Lauren, they're here for you." "They've been looking for me for a while," I said. Flashbulbs flared through the windows. Shadows moved on the porch. Someone shouted, "Ms. Bishop, can you comment on the acquisition?" The entire table turned toward me. Ethan whispered, "Holy." "Lauren, they're here for you." My phone buzzed again nonstop. Executives, legal national outlets, everyone needing a statement. Dad stared at me like he was meeting me for the first time. "You planned all of this," he said slowly. "Not the leak," I replied, "but the work." "Yes." Mom covered her mouth. "This changes everything." "No," I said. "It just reveals what was already true." Outside, the reporters grew louder. Inside, my family finally fell silent for the right reasons. For the first time in my life, I didn't shrink in this house. I stood. Dad stepped aside without a word, a gesture I'd never received from him in 32 years. My phone kept buzzing. I took a steady breath, smoothed the front of my jacket, and looked toward the front door where the world was waiting. Thanksgiving dinner was over. My life, the real one, was finally beginning. I didn't bother waiting for anyone to catch up. The moment the voices outside swelled, I moved down the hallway toward the front door, the old floorboards creaking under my heels, like they were reacting to a different version of me than the one they were used to carrying. Through the frosted glass panels, I could see silhouettes shifting, cameras, raised microphones angled forward, names of national networks pressed against the cold November air. Dad reached the foyer a few steps behind me, still trying to gather authority he no longer fully held. "Lauren, you can't just walk out there," he said, voice tight, not from worry for me, but from the fear of losing control over the narrative inside his own house. I didn't slow down. "I'm not planning to give an interview." "Then what are you doing?" he asked. Stepping outside, I answered, breathing. He didn't know what to do with that. Outside, reporters were calling my name with a sense of urgency I'd grown used to over the last 18 months, the kind of tone people use when they know a story is evolving by the second. The porch lights flickered onto their faces, a sea of lenses pointed straight at me, but I stayed on my side of the door, letting the distance hold them back. Inside, I could hear whispering from the dining room chairs, shifting cousins whispering, Mom pacing, Ethan swearing under his breath. It didn't matter, not anymore. I stepped away from the door and headed toward the living room instead. The curtains were still open, framing the manicured lawn and the lights of passing cars. Mom hurried after me, wringing her hands like she could squeeze the right words out of them. "Lauren, sweetheart, you should tell us what's going on," she said softly, as if gentleness could undo years of condescension. Her eyes were wide, trying to read a version of me she'd never acknowledged existed. "It's all in the article," I said. "That isn't the same as hearing it from you." I turned to her. "You never listened when I tried." The honesty stung her more than any headline outside. Ethan wandered in next, his expression twitchy and unsettled. "So, this is real," he said. "All of it." "It is." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You're L. Carter." I nodded. "But that's the name behind all those digital acquisitions. The international bureaus, the documentary platform." His voice cracked like he couldn't reconcile the woman in front of him with the headline on his screen. "That's right. And you—" He pointed vaguely toward the foyer where the reporters waited. "You did that alone. I had a team," I said. "A good one. But yes, the vision was mine." Mom sat down slowly, like her legs had forgotten how to hold her. "All these years," she murmured. "Why did you hide it from us?" I didn't want to rehash the same question again, but the weight of her voice forced me to answer. "Because I knew the reaction wouldn't have been supported," I said. "It would have been a doubt, interference, pressure to do it your way instead of mine." She flinched. Dad looked away. The truth was inconvenient, but it was still the truth. I crossed the room and looked out the window again. Reporters were still gathered in a tight semicircle at the end of the driveway, breath-fogging in the cold. Someone had already gone live on social media, their phone pointed toward the house. The world was waiting, and my family still didn't know how many secrets they'd missed. Dad finally spoke. "This kind of attention, it isn't safe." "What are you going to do now?" "I'm going back to the city," I said. "There's a lot to handle." "You shouldn't go alone," Mom insisted, rising to her feet. "Let your father drive you." I gave a small, almost amused exhale. "That won't be necessary. Security is already on the way." Dad's head snapped up. "Security?" I checked my phone. "They should be pulling in any minute." As if on cue, headlights approached, sleek black, unmistakably corporate. A moment later, 2 private security escorts stepped out, scanning the property like they'd rehearsed it. They moved with purpose, professionalism, and zero hesitation. Mom brought a hand to her mouth. "Lauren, you have security teams part of the job." Dad's eyebrows shot up. "This is significant." "It's been significant for a long time," I said. "You just didn't see it." The house fell quiet. Not the awkward quiet that filled childhood dinners, but something heavier, recognition maybe, or the realization that the roles they'd always assigned me were suddenly irrelevant. I checked the time. "I need to go." Mom reached for my arm. "Will we see you tomorrow?" "For brunch?" I hesitated. I wasn't sure what the right answer was anymore. Dad stepped closer. "Your mother asked you a question." The old tone command masked as care. But I wasn't the girl who wilted under it. "I'll let you know," I said calmly. The lack of a commitment landed harder than any outburst would have. I walked toward the front door, security outside, waiting, their radios crackling softly in the background. Ethan followed me slower, carrying something in his hands. Not arrogance this time, uncertainty. "Lauren," he said, stopping me before I reached the door. "Earlier, I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," I said gently, "but it's done." He swallowed. "You really built that empire." I nodded once. He let out a breath that sounded like surrender. "Damn. I never knew you had that in you." I opened the door. Cold air rushed in, cleaner than anything in that house. Reporters shouted my name again, cameras flashing as the security team moved into position. Before stepping out, I glanced back at the dining room half-eaten plates, still warm rolls, the remnants of a life they always assumed I'd never outgrow. Then I looked at Ethan, at the stunned realization settling into his features. "You never asked," I said. And with that, I walked into the night, toward the cameras, the chaos, and the life I had built without them, the life that had just become impossible to hide. The SUV pulled away from my parents' house with a smooth, controlled glide, the kind that came from engines built for executives who didn't have time for jolts or delays. Through the tinted glass, I watched the reporters' reflections disappear, their voices fading into a distant murmur behind the hum of the engine. Mapleton Ridge slipped into darkness, and for the first time all evening I felt myself breathe fully. No eyes judging, no laughter scraping at my ribs. No one trying to shrink me back into the version of Lauren they preferred. The city lights appeared ahead like a constellation scattered across steel and glass. Manhattan had always felt like its own organism, restless, electric, unforgiving, and yet somehow it had held more space for me than my own family ever managed to. The car turned toward Midtown, where my office tower rose above the others with a quiet confidence I spent years manufacturing. My security details spoke into their radios as we approached the private entrance. Arriving with the principal, lobby secure. The level of precision would have shocked my family. To me, it was routine. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and I stepped into the lobby I'd walked through 1,000 times, high ceilings, dark wood, modern lines, the scent of expensive quiet. But tonight it all felt different. Tonight I wasn't slipping in like a ghost, trying to outrun comparisons to Ethan or expectations from my father. Tonight I walked through the doors as the woman the world was suddenly talking about. When I reached the top floor, the lights were already on. My team didn't wait for instructions they gathered because they knew a storm like this didn't blow over on its own. CFO Jerry was pacing by the conference room window, tie-loosened shirt sleeves rolled up. "We lost the embargo. Everything's out. Every outlet picked it up." "Good," I said. "It needed to go public eventually." He blinked at me. "You're unusually calm. I stopped being afraid of headlines a long time ago." Amanda, my head of communications, was scrolling through her tablet at high speed. "We've got 34 interview requests already. 3 from networks we now own, 10 from ones still pretending they're not intimidated, and the rest from business magazines." "Decline all," I said. Amanda's eyes shot up. All, for now. I need control of the narrative before I speak to anyone." She nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing. "We expected you to say that." The table was covered in printouts, market movement charts, early investor reactions, draft statements, legal memos, PR projections. My team had been preparing for this moment ever since the acquisition entered its final stage, but no one expected the reveal to hit on Thanksgiving night. I walked to the window overlooking the city, feeling its pulse vibrating through the glass. A skyline like this had a way of reminding you where you stood, and tonight, for the first time, I felt the weight of what I had become, someone with enough influence to shift markets, to resurrect failing networks, to terrify companies that once dismissed me. "How's the staff taking it?" I asked, still looking out. "Shocked," Amanda said, "but in a good way." Within 10 minutes of the article dropping, our internal Slack channels lit up like fireworks. People are thrilled. They finally know who's been protecting their jobs. A warmth flickered in my chest, the kind I never felt at my parents' dinner table. Respect, not an obligation, no pity, actual respect. And competitors, I asked. Jerry let out a breath, panicking. 3 executives from rival networks resigned tonight. Energy Tech's PR team is scrambling. They're assuming the acquisition means your investigation into them will go wider. "It will," I said simply. A few heads around the room lifted, something fierce sparking behind their eyes. This was why they followed me, not because of charisma or theatrics, but because I moved quietly and decisively, and they trusted my direction more than any spotlight. Amanda stepped forward with a printed copy of the Wall Street Journal article. "They photographed you at 26, she said. "Graduation day. Before all of this." I glanced at the image, the young woman with straightened hair, a slightly uncertain smile, a degree clutched in both hands like a shield. She looked fragile compared to the person standing in this room now. But the fire in her eyes, same, just hidden better back then. My phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Dad, 12 missed calls. Mom, 7 missed calls. Ethan, 4 texts. Allison, "We need to talk." I turned the screen face down. Amanda noticed. "Want me to prepare a statement addressing your family angle? Every outlet is hinting at tension." "No." My voice was steadier than I felt. "They're not part of this story." "But they're part of tonight," Jerry said quietly. "Not by my choice." Silence filled the room. Not judgment, just understanding. Sasha from legal entered with a binder in her arms. We reviewed the leak. It wasn't internal. Someone outside the team pulled a filing early. Possibly an analyst tipped off the journal. I nodded. "We'll deal with it. For now, focus on stabilizing the markets." Another buzz from my phone. Another call from home. My jaw tightened. "I need 10 minutes, I told the room. They dispersed without question, giving me space. I stepped onto the private balcony adjoining my office. The night air wrapped around me, cold, brisk, sharp enough to clear the noise still stuck in my head from Mapleton Ridge. Below me, the city stretched wide and endless, moving fast, refusing to pause for anyone's discomfort. It felt like the opposite of home, unforgiving, impatient, but it also never asked me to shrink. My reflection caught in the glass door, older, harder, steadier than the girl who'd spent years trying not to make waves at the holiday table. The phone buzzed again. This time I answered. Mom's voice broke through, immediately shaken. "Lauren, please call back. We're confused. We're scared. We don't understand any of this." I closed my eyes for a beat. "You never wanted to," I said gently. There was silence on her end, the kind filled with things she didn't know how to say. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "just tell us what happens now." I looked out at the city, at my networks, at everything I'd built. What happens now? Stepping into this new reality felt like crossing a line I could never cross. The battles ahead were already taking shape, sharp enough to taste in the cold air. And whatever version of my life existed before tonight had dissolved for good. "I'll let you know," I told her. Then I hung up, slipped the phone into my pocket, and walked back inside toward the room of people who actually believed in me, toward the empire that needed me alert, toward the future that didn't care about Mapleton Ridge or its narrow expectations. Thanksgiving was over. War season was starting. By the time the sun pushed over the skyline the next morning, I was already wide awake in my office, sitting barefoot on the couch with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands. Sleep hadn't bothered trying to find me. Adrenaline had kept me upright. Memory kept me company. Because as soon as the headlines broke, as soon as the world started connecting my name to Bishop Media Group, every piece of the past I'd buried began rising to the surface, like it had only been waiting for the right moment. Cole was the first ghost that showed up. The quiet of the early morning made it too easy to hear echoes, his voice calm in a way that always felt just slightly rehearsed, his questions disguised as concern, the way he'd tilt his head when he wanted to nudge me in a direction that served him more than me. I rubbed my temples, staring at the soft glow of the skyline as I remembered the first time he told me he believed in my writing. How flattering it had felt back then. How dangerous it had turned out to be. He was the one who insisted on helping me edit my early drafts as a loving fiancé, all while planting little doubts about my abilities. He was the one who coached me on how to sell myself better, then smiled when I dimmed my ambitions to keep the peace. And he was the one who swore he wanted a partner, yet acted like he deserved an assistant. I should have seen it sooner. But I was younger then, too willing to assume manipulation sounded like guidance. The darkest memory came back with full force the night I discovered the resume he'd rewritten for me behind my back. Sections erased, achievements moved, titles softened. You don't want to intimidate hiring managers, he told me, like he was doing me a favor. He was exactly the kind of man who'd thrive in my family. Exactly the kind of man I built my empire to never need again. A knock pulled me briefly out of the past. Amanda peeked in. The full press list is updated. Investors want to schedule calls. Staff wants direction for the internal town hall. Give me 10 minutes, I said. She nodded and left, and the door clicked shut again, sealing me back in the quiet that demanded old truths be faced. Because tonight wasn't just about my family finding out who I'd become. It was about them realizing who I'd had to leave behind to get here. Dad never believed in writing unless it could secure a board seat. Mom valued social appearances over integrity. Ethan cared only for anything that boosted his image. Allison needed status the way other people needed oxygen. And Cole, he studied my family like a blueprint. He knew exactly which buttons to press to earn their approval before the engagement. He knew the rules, the postures, the tone, even the tempo of conversation they admired. He could have slipped into their world effortlessly. But me, I was too busy trying to carve out a place in a different one. The worst part of remembering Cole wasn't the manipulation itself. It was how close I came to settling, because I'd been taught settling was safe, predictable, acceptable. He treated my ideas like stepping stones, supporting them only when he saw a way to attach his name to the outcome. And when it came to my work, his interest never reached beyond irritation. The only thing he ever wanted to know was how long it would pull me away from standing beside him at his work events. And on the night I ended the engagement, he said the quiet part out loud. "You're not meant for big ambitions, Lauren. You don't have the temperament for it." The memory made something low in my stomach twist, but not from hurt anymore, from disbelief at how thoroughly I'd outgrown him. My phone buzzed a message from my private investigator, Lowell, the only man I'd trusted during those years, the one who helped confirm that Cole wasn't simply insecure. He was strategically aligning himself to marry into a richer branch of my family if things with me didn't work out. On the screen, Lowell saw the news. "Congratulations. And FYI, Cole tried to pull your old resume from his cloud storage last night. Thought you'd want to know." I exhaled a slow breath. Of course he had. It was surreal realizing that even people from my past were scrambling, now adjusting their stories, trying to erase their fingerprints before the world connected dots they didn't want connected. I typed back, "Thank you. Keep monitoring." Then I set the phone down and let the silence settle again. The truth was simple. My family's disbelief last night wasn't new. It had been the soundtrack of my 20s. They shaped a version of Lauren that never existed, timid, underachieving, fragile, and expected me to stay where they placed me. But the hours I kept, the work I did behind closed doors, the deals I forged in full anonymity, that was the real story. The Bishop family had crafted a narrative for me, and I had rewritten it in silence. The office door opened again, this time Jerry holding a stack of documents and an expression that meant we had a lot to cover. "Are you ready?" he asked. I stood smoothing my jacket. More than ready. As we stepped into the conference room where the team was waiting, the memories of my family's voices faded behind me, not gone, but distant. Like echoes in a house I no longer lived in. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to run from the past. I'd outbuilt it. And now, it was time to turn all that work outward toward the networks I'd saved the industry I intended to reshape, and the people who finally believed in the version of me I'd always known was real. The internal town hall was scheduled for 9 in the morning, but by 8:30, the entire newsroom floor was already buzzing. Producers crowding around monitors, editors flipping through early reports, junior staff whispering in clusters as though the walls themselves might be listening. The reveal of my identity had pulled everyone into a current. None of them expected, and I could feel the charge in the air the moment the elevator doors opened. Amanda caught up with me halfway to the conference room. Every seat's taken. People are standing along the back wall. I think they want reassurance. They'll get more than that, I said. Not because I planned to give them a speech, because I'd built something worth trusting before they even knew my name. Inside conversations hushed as soon as I stepped forward. Faces I'd known only through weekly reports or on-camera briefings were now turned fully toward me. Curiosity, relief, shock, and something that felt suspiciously like pride flickering across them. Jerry opened the meeting briskly. "Thank you all for joining on short notice. As you've seen, last night's early publication revealed information about our ownership that was scheduled for release next week. Ms. Bishop." He stepped aside. I walked to the front and set my notes down without looking at them. I didn't need a script for this. "I know the last 12 hours have been chaotic," I said, letting my voice carry across the room. "You've learned that the person making decisions from behind the scenes is not a faceless investor, but someone who's been walking through this building for years. You also learned that my name has been attached to a deal bigger than anything this industry has seen in a decade." A few nods, a few smiles. Confidence was contagious, always had been. But the truth is, I continued. The work hasn't changed. The mission hasn't changed. The only thing that changed is that now you know exactly who's been fighting to keep this newsroom alive. A producer near the aisle whispered something to a colleague, something like, "Finally," and I felt a warmth rise in my chest, better than any approval I'd ever received at a family dinner. "What I need from all of you is simple," I said. "Keep doing the work. Keep telling stories that matter. Keep challenging the industry. I didn't buy these networks to turn them into trophies. I bought them to prove that quality journalism still deserves a place in this world." Heads lifted, shoulders straightened. It was subtle, but unmistakable, an entire room ready to follow. After the meeting, people lined up to talk. One of the video editors stopped me first, her relief unmistakable, as she explained how the cuts I'd made to executive overhead had kept her entire team employed. A senior correspondent pulled me aside next, admitting he'd been days away from resigning before the changes I pushed through quietly revived his budget. Then an intern barely out of college looked at me like she was seeing something impossible. I didn't realize the person running all of this was you. I smiled. Most people didn't. When the crowd thinned, Amanda pulled up beside me. "You just won the entire building." "I didn't need to win them," I said. "I just needed them to know who they'd been working with." I was heading back to my office when Sasha intercepted me with a folder. "We have a problem." She didn't sugarcoat. She never did. "What now?" "One of the former senior producers from Channel 9 is trying to push a narrative that you manipulated stock prices through anonymous acquisitions. He's hinting he has proof." I raised a brow. "Does he? No. But he's loud, and he's desperate. He sees an opportunity to attach himself to your name." I could almost predict the man Sasha meant self-important, allergic to accountability, laid off last year after an internal HR investigation he somehow blamed on everyone except himself. His kind always resurfaced when someone else succeeded. "Have a legal monitor for him," I said. "Don't engage unless he escalates." "There's more," Sasha added. Two tech bloggers are circulating a rumor about your engagement ending because of financial disputes. Ah, Cole's shadow again. I exhaled slowly. Shut it down. Her lips twitched, half sympathy, half satisfaction. Already working on it. When she walked away, I leaned my palms against my office counter. My reflection stared back from the darkened glass, steady, composed, but undeniably tired. The past had a way of clawing at the present when you least expected it. Not an hour passed before Lowell called. He didn't bother with pleasantries. You should know, he said, someone reached out to me this morning asking for dirt on you. Anonymous email. No signature. Let me guess, I said they want proof I'm not qualified. They want anything that makes you look fragile. I resisted the urge to laugh. Of all the things I was fragile wasn't one. They won't find what they're looking for, I said. They won't, he agreed, but they're trying. I can keep digging if you want. Do that. When I hung up, my phone buzzed again this time from an unknown number. I ignored it. 5 seconds later, a voicemail popped up, and even before I hit play, I knew. Cole. His voice came through artificially calm. Lauren, congratulations on your big moment. I think we should talk. There are things the media doesn't need to know. Call me back. I stared at the wall, a cold clarity settling deep in my stomach. This was why people like him panicked. When you outgrow the narrative they built for you, they scramble to rewrite it. But he wasn't the only one rattled. Minutes later, Ethan texted, "We need to meet. Dad's losing it. Call ASAP." Then Allison. "Mom wants answers. You owe her that much." Then Dad himself. "We expect you here tonight. Bring clarity." Clarity. The irony almost made me smile. By the time the texts started rolling in from Mapleton Ridge, the message behind them was obvious. They weren't just asking questions. They were scrambling for proximity, suddenly eager for the access they once dismissed and grasping for a relationship they'd never invested in until now. Amanda poked her head into the office again. "Press is calming down," she said, "but the personal angle is getting traction. People are curious about your family dynamics. Tell them it's irrelevant," I said. "Will that hold?" "It will, if I say so." She nodded, then left me alone with the city buzzing outside the glass. I sank onto the edge of my desk, letting the weight of the morning settle. My family wanted control. The media wanted a story. Cole wanted leverage. Competitors wanted cracks in my armor. And I wanted one thing, to run this empire without the ghosts of Mapleton Ridge clawing at my every move. But ghosts had a habit of showing up when you least expected them, and today they were lining up at the door. By the time evening rolled in, Manhattan had taken on that steel blue glow it always wore before storms. Quiet, expectant, full of pressure, waiting to break. I was still in my office jacket off hair pinned back, trying to finish a round of investor calls, when my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Ethan. "Dinner. 8 o'clock. Dad says it's mandatory." Mandatory. The word alone carried every memory I'd tried to outgrow. I stared at the message for a long moment, knowing exactly what the invitation was. It wasn't an attempt to make peace, and it definitely wasn't remorse, just control wrapped in concern. But avoiding them would only sharpen the narrative they were already spinning for themselves, so I sent a reply, "Fine. 1 hour. No more." I arrived at the restaurant just after 8, escorted by security through a side entrance. The room they'd chosen was private dim lights, dark wood, the kind of place my father always favored, because it made him feel like a king holding court. He was already seated at the head of the table. Of course he was. Mom sat to his right, Allison to his left. Ethan paced near the window, checking his watch, like he had somewhere more important to be. Their quiet conversations died the moment I walked in, and suddenly the room felt too still. Dad cleared his throat posture stiff. "Lauren." "Dad." He gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Sit. We need to talk about everything." I took my seat without letting his tone sink its hooks into me. A server entered pouring water, offering menus none of us touched. The clatter of dishes from outside drifted in like distant static. Mom leaned forward first, her voice soft in a way that didn't match her eyes. "We were blindsided, sweetheart. Completely blindsided." Allison nodded quickly. You could have trusted us. The words struck me with a bitter kind of humor. I didn't laugh, but something in me tightened. You want honesty? I said, meeting each of their eyes. You weren't safe people to trust. The silence that followed was immediate heavy. Dad's jaw flexed. We're your family. That never made you trustworthy, I replied. Ethan stopped pacing and finally sat down. Look, we're not here to fight. We're trying to understand. I kept my forearms flat on the table, then asked something worth answering. Dad inhaled sharply, but controlled his temper. Fine. I'll start. Why the secrecy? You've been running a company of this scale and never mentioned a word. Why? For the same reason you never listened when I tried to talk about my work, I said. You'd already decided who I was. Mom's shoulders slumped, but she didn't deny it. You treated my career like a hobby, I continued, like something cute, harmless, something that didn't belong in your world. That's not fair, Dad said. It's accurate, I countered. Every holiday you made sure I knew I wasn't measuring up. Every conversation you compared me to Allison. Every time I mentioned a story or a project you dismissed it as noise. Allison flinched. I didn't know you felt that way. You didn't try to know. The server arrived with entrees none of us had ordered, Dad waving him away as if the interruption personally offended him. Once the door closed, he leaned forward. Regardless of past misunderstandings, there are consequences to what's happening now. You're in the spotlight. That comes with risk. I'm aware. Then act like it, he snapped. Ethan stepped in quickly. Dad, no. Dad held up a hand. She needs to understand the position she's put herself in. I met his stare without blinking. The only position I'm in is the one I built. He exhaled through his nose, trying to regain control. Let's stay practical. If you'd consulted me earlier, I could have helped you navigate this. You need structure guidance. I don't need a handler. I didn't say handler. I said, you implied it. The tension sharpened, slicing the room into two sides, the version of me they were comfortable with, and the version sitting in front of them now. Mom tried to soften the edges. We're worried, sweetheart. The press is digging through your past. People are asking questions. They do that for every CEO, but not every CEO has a family. People are watching this closely, Allison said. We need to be careful, too. There it was, the truth beneath the concern. You're afraid of how this reflects on you, I said quietly. Allison looked away. Mom swallowed. Dad said nothing. The air screw tight. I get it, I continued, but your reputation is not my responsibility. It never was. Dad finally broke. We raised you. We gave you everything. You gave me rules, I said. You gave me pressure. You gave me a script to follow, but you never gave me respect. The words hit him harder than I expected. His expression flickered anger, then disbelief, then something like shame quickly hidden. Ethan leaned forward, voice low. Lauren, we didn't know what you were building. You didn't want to know. No, that's not... You didn't ask. Ethan fell silent. I sat back. All of this, I said, motioning vaguely toward the world outside the restaurant, happened because I stopped seeking your permission. Mom's eyes glistened. We just want to be part of your life. You were part of the version you preferred, I said. Not the real one. The room held its breath. Dad straightened his cufflinks, a gesture he used when he wanted to move a conversation where he felt stronger. Well, he said slowly, if we can't change the past, we can at least fix the future. We should consider presenting a unified front, publicly. I stared at him. A statement? A family image, he corrected. It would stabilize things, protect all of us. There it was, his real angle. Protect the bishop's name, I said. His lack of denial was answer enough. I shook my head. I'm not packaging my family for PR optics. Lauren, no. The finality in my voice froze everyone. I stood. We're done here. Mom rose too. Please don't leave like this. I came, I said. I listened. But I'm not bending myself back into the shape this family prefers. Not again. I stepped away from the table toward the door where my security waited. Before leaving, I looked back at Dad's rigid posture, Allison's discomfort, Mom's pleading eyes, Ethan's uncertainty. For the first time, none of it pulled at me. I don't owe you a version of me that no longer exists, I said. and then I left the door closing behind me with a quiet final click. Cole showed up exactly when I expected him to, late enough to look unbothered, early enough to make it seem intentional. I found him waiting outside my building the next morning, leaning against the stone column near the private entrance, as if he belonged in spaces built for power he never actually held. The moment he saw me, he straightened, smoothing his jacket like he was prepping for an audience. "Lauren," he said, giving me that practiced half smile I once mistook for sincerity. "You've been busy." I didn't slow my pace. "You shouldn't be here." "That's not true," he replied, falling into step beside me. "We have unfinished business." My security team moved subtly closer, but I signaled them to hold. I wanted to hear what he thought he still had to say. He took a breath tone, shifting into a version of concerned familiarity he'd perfected years ago. "The press is digging. They're speculating about your personal life, about us." "There is no us," I said. "That's not how it looks when your name is suddenly everywhere," he continued. "People assume things. They ask questions. I'm trying to protect you." I almost laughed. "From what?" Truth you don't want resurfacing." His jaw tightened. "Don't twist this." I stopped walking. He nearly collided with me. "You're here," I said, "because you're afraid the narrative will paint you accurately." His eyes flickered. Guilt, panic, calculation. It was all there, rolling behind the charm he'd relied on for too long. "I just want to talk," he said quietly, privately. "You owe me at least that." I felt heat rise behind my ribs, not anger, but the realization that he still believed he had rights to my time, to my story, to my identity. "Owe you," I repeated. "For what?" He opened his mouth, but no answer came out. And there it was. The truth he could never articulate. He missed the woman he'd almost managed to sculpt into something small enough to orbit him. I stepped back. "If you want something from me, say it." His shoulders dropped. "Fine. I don't need trouble. I don't need reporters asking why our engagement ended. I don't need my firm digging into the past." I said softly. "There it is." He swallowed hard. "All you were thinking about was how you looked to the world, your reputation, your trajectory, the bubble you lived in," I said, letting each word land. "That's not fair. It's honest." He tried again, reaching for a calmer tone. "Look, things didn't end perfectly between us. But we cared about each other once. That should count for something." He'd once tried to sell those patterns of behavior as affection, but it was never about partnership. And whatever he liked to call love was nothing more than the comfort of knowing I'd bend myself into the shape he preferred. "We both know why it ended," I said. "You wanted a partner who stayed in your shadow, someone who made you look good, someone who walked 2 steps behind." His expression hardened. "You're exaggerating." "You rewrote my resume," I reminded him, "behind my back." His throat worked, but he didn't deny it. "You told your colleagues I was lucky to have you," I added. "And you told me I wasn't built for leadership. That was a lie you needed me to believe." We stood on the cold pavement, the noise of traffic rushing around us while the weight of the past settled between us like fog. Cole exhaled. "So that's it. No conversation. No clarity. Just the door closing forever." "There doesn't need to be a door," I said. "There just isn't a return path." He stared at me for a beat, the realization sinking in with a kind of slow devastation. The woman standing in front of him wasn't someone he could mold or manage. She never had been. He just hadn't paid enough attention to notice. My phone rang Amanda. I answered with a nod to signal the conversation was done. "Lauren," she said urgently, "we've got a problem." HR flagged something from Channel 9, an incident report tied to a senior anchor, the same man who accused you of manipulating stock prices. There's a misconduct complaint aimed at him. Is it credible? Very. And it involves someone he mentored. It's messy. Of course it was. Corporate rot always flinched hardest when the light hit it. "I'll review it," I said. "Send everything to my office." I hung up. Cole was still there watching me with a mix of frustration and something sharper fear of irrelevance. "You've changed," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "You're just seeing me clearly for the first time." He stepped back defeated in a way he couldn't disguise. Without another word, he turned and walked away, fading into the morning crowd like a chapter I should have closed years ago. I didn't watch him go. I crossed the sidewalk, security falling into step as I headed toward the entrance, toward responsibility, toward decisions real and consequential toward the empire he once claimed I wasn't capable of building. Inside the elevator, the doors closed with a muted thud. My reflection stared back at me, not unscarred, not untouched by everything that came before, but stronger in ways my past couldn't measure. The ghosts that tried to follow me were losing their grip, and the world, for better or worse, was finally meeting the woman I'd become without excuses, without disguises, without anyone else's permission. The misconduct report arrived on my desk just before noon, heavy enough to warn me this wasn't a misunderstanding, but a full map of the rot that had been allowed to grow inside one of the flagship networks. Page after page detailed the same man who'd been shouting my name across interviews, late-night meetings with junior staff, pressure disguised as mentorship travel expenses that made no sense, and a trail of evasions that suggested he'd been shielded for years by people too comfortable to bother looking closely. As I read, a cold steadiness settled into me, the kind that sharpened focus rather than clouded it. Right on cue, Amanda stepped in and shut the door behind her, her expression a mix of irritation and something close to exhaustion. She told me the anchor was escalating his noise, hinting that he had inside knowledge about my rise, whispering to any reporter who would listen. It was predictable. Desperation always tried to outrun consequences. I told her I wasn't concerned about his claims, and she nodded because she already knew the truth was on my side, not his. We discussed the risk of fallout, the media temperature, the internal morale, and she agreed we needed to get ahead of this before rumors hardened into assumptions. She left just as Jerry appeared in her place, looking uneasy in a way I didn't often see. He explained that the front desk had forwarded a call from Ethan to him by mistake, and that my brother wanted an urgent meeting on behalf of my father. They had come to the building and were parked in the lobby, waiting for me to appear like I was still the daughter who could be summoned with a tone of voice. I told him they weren't to be let past security and that they could wait as long as they liked. Dad's urgency was never about me, it was always about appearances. I returned to the folder reviewing fraudulent reimbursements tied to the same anchor and a producer he'd repeatedly mentored, the kind of pattern that no one had bothered to confront until it fell in my lap with the acquisition. What was documented here wasn't a minor breach. It was the blueprint of a culture that had rotted from the inside. Before I could get deeper, my phone rang. Security patched Ethan through after I instructed them to do it just this once. His voice came in hot, frustrated, already brimming with entitlement. He insisted the family needed answers, claimed the press coverage was hurting all of them, and argued that my new position brought unwanted attention to the bishop's name. Every sentence confirmed what I already knew. Their panic wasn't rooted in concern for me, but fear that my autonomy was finally bigger than their control. I reminded him that their discomfort wasn't my responsibility, and when he tried to spin it as familial loyalty, I ended the call cleanly. Before blocking the lobby line, I immediately called my board chairman. I need an emergency session scheduled for tomorrow morning. We're releasing the full internal audit timeline on Channel 9's finances. I want the documents prepared now. A short while later, Sasha arrived with a tablet full of cross-referenced data tying the misconduct case to a separate internal audit from last year. That audit had flagged inconsistencies in expense reports, unapproved travel, and off-the-record payments routed through personal accounts. The puzzle pieces clicked with a disturbing precision. This wasn't just a predatory workplace dynamic. It was a hybrid of fraud and abuse that had lived comfortably inside a network too fractured to hold anyone accountable. I instructed her to gather every shred of documentation so we could proceed with a full investigation. She left with a sharp nod, already moving faster than I'd asked. I turned back to my desk, tapping the surface with a pen. The weight of responsibility pressed deeper into my thoughts, not a burden, but a recognition. I hadn't acquired these networks to preserve the old flaws that killed trust from the inside out. Taking ownership meant reclaiming the integrity that should have guided them all along, even if it meant ripping up entire systems that people had grown comfortable hiding behind. This was the real core of the job, and honestly, the part I had always been built for, the point at which a leader chooses whether to ignore the ugliness or drag it into daylight. My decision was already made. The network belonged to me, and whatever damage sat at its foundation was mine to confront and reconstruct. The building had emptied out by the time I wrapped the final call with legal, but I wasn't ready to leave. My desk was covered in the pieces of the fraud case, the misconduct statements, and a preliminary financial map that showed exactly how long the network had been quietly bleeding under people who called themselves leaders. My eyes felt dry, my back stiff, yet my mind sharpened with each connection I uncovered, because once the patterns emerged, everything else snapped into its place with brutal clarity. I could see exactly who benefited, who stayed quiet, and who allowed the damage to grow because they didn't want trouble in their lap. Just as I reached for another folder, my phone lit up with a call from a number I didn't recognize, and I ignored it, assuming it was another reporter fishing for a quote. When it rang again, my curiosity crept in. The timing was too pointed to be accidental. I answered, and Lowell's voice came through low and tense, in a way that made my shoulders brace. He told me the anchor we were investigating had ties to a smaller digital outlet that was preparing a hit piece aimed at me, a sloppy mix of personal speculation and half-truths stitched together in the hope of framing me as vindictive or unprepared for power. He explained that the outlet had been fed selective information, the kind only accessible to someone internal, and that the goal was to paint the investigation as a personal vendetta rather than a necessary reckoning. For a moment, irritation edged in, not because I was afraid of the story, but because it was the oldest tactic in the book. When men in threatened positions realize the truth is about to corner them, they reach for mud. And when mud doesn't work, they reach for fear. I asked Lowell to trace the source and tighten all internal communication channels. The leaks weren't deadly, but they were annoying, and annoyance in my world often signaled a deeper rot someone hoped I wouldn't look at too closely. After the call, I closed my laptop and stood by the window, the city lit beneath me like a constellation of promises and consequences. I knew stepping into full visibility meant attracting every kind of ambition, those who wanted proximity, those who wanted protection, and those who wanted revenge. Power didn't just come with weight. It came with shadows that tried to reshape themselves into warnings. My phone buzzed again this time with a text from my mother. "Come home tonight. Your father insists." I didn't bother responding. I already knew that house wasn't a sanctuary. It was a stage where they rehearsed a version of family that had never applied to me. Before I returned to my desk, Amanda slipped back into my office without knocking her face pale enough to tell me something had shifted. She told me that during the initial review of travel expenses tied to the anchor, they found payments routed through an outside consulting firm with no legitimate work history. The firm was nothing more than a shell, and if the early math was correct, the sum funneled through it exceeded anything we'd anticipated. This wasn't simple misconduct or casual fraud. It was coordinated. My pulse stayed steady as I absorbed the information, because the moment I decided to step into ownership, I'd expected ghosts like this to surface. We talked through next steps, legal strategy, containment messaging, and a full audit of any department that had been touched by the network's previous leadership. Once she left, I dropped into my chair and let the weight of the day settle inside me, not as heaviness, but as a kind of fuel. Everything happening, the leaks, the fear, the noise meant I was pulling at the right threads. And the people who had thrived in the dark corners of these networks were realizing their time was up. I glanced at the misconduct file again. The faces of the young employees who'd been dismissed, overlooked, or quietly intimidated stayed with me. This was why the acquisition mattered. This was why the empire needed rebuilding from the inside out. I opened the network's internal policy manual, marking every clause that needed to be rewritten for accountability and transparency. This moment had nothing to do with stock prices or media fascination or the sudden glare of public attention. It was the work behind the curtain, the kind that required spine more than spotlight, that defined who deserved to lead and who deserved to lose their seat. and I wasn't going to flinch, not now, not when the true shape of the fight was finally revealing itself. The tension in the newsroom shifted the moment I stepped inside that morning, a kind of alertness that told me word of the investigation had already begun circulating beneath the surface, even though we hadn't released a single statement. HR had sent their latest findings before sunrise, and as I scanned through the updated timeline, it became clear that the misconduct and fraudulent transactions weren't isolated incidents, but threads woven through years of unchecked behavior, all protected by people who had convinced themselves it was easier to look away. I walked toward my office with a controlled calm, acknowledging nods from employees who had no idea how close their workplace had come to collapse under the weight of its own neglect. Amanda was waiting at my door, holding a file so thick it barely stayed closed, and she started talking the moment we were alone, explaining how the shell corporation we'd identified wasn't just a hiding place for expenses, but a funnel into personal accounts tied directly to the anchor and two producers. She said the irregularities stretched back nearly 5 years, masked under vague budget codes that only someone high enough in the hierarchy could manipulate. I absorbed each detail carefully, feeling the pieces lock into place like a puzzle that had been waiting for someone to bother assembling it. Before I could respond, security contacted me to report that my father had returned to the lobby, insisting he had a scheduled meeting with me that didn't exist. I instructed them to keep him where he was, and the moment the line disconnected, Amanda gave me a look that held equal parts sympathy and frustration. I told her to proceed with full documentation for legal review and to prepare a briefing for the board. Then I shut my office door and let the weight of everything settle. My phone buzzed with messages from Ethan, first demanding, then pleading, and then from my mother, who attempted to frame their sudden obsession with my decisions as concern, though the tone revealed exactly what it was: fear of losing control of a narrative they had always assumed they authored. I didn't bother replying. Instead, I opened the misconduct file again and read through the employee statements, the kind written with shaky restraint by people who had convinced themselves no one would ever care enough to act. Their words forced me to acknowledge that whatever chaos the acquisition brought into my personal life, the work itself mattered more than any temporary discomfort. These employees deserved a leader who confronted the truth without turning away. Halfway through my review, Sasha arrived with information that pushed the situation into an even darker territory. One of the producers implicated had attempted to erase his involvement by deleting internal communications, but the digital forensics team recovered enough fragments to confirm he had been coordinating with the anchor to redirect department funds into their shell firm. She warned me that both men were likely preparing to claim retaliation publicly and might even try to position themselves as victims of a new CEO flexing power. I reminded her that truth didn't require theatrics, it required endurance. She left to begin the next stage of the audit, and I returned to the window, taking in the reflection, staring back, steady, measured, unwilling to bend. The knock on my door this time belonged not to my staff, but to security, informing me that my father was refusing to leave the building unless he spoke to me. I didn't raise my voice. I simply instructed them to escort him to a small conference room upstairs where I would meet him on my terms, not his. As I walked down the hallway, the familiar heat of old wounds pressed against my ribs, not enough to weaken me, but enough to remind me how much I had outgrown and how much they still underestimated. When I entered the room, he didn't sit. He stood like a man accustomed to commanding attention, insisting that the family's reputation was being jeopardized by narratives he didn't approve of. He spoke of optics of responsibility of legacy, and he spilled every word with the assumption that I would fold under the sheer force of his expectations. I let him speak because interrupting him would have been pointless. When he finally paused, I explained in a clear, even voice that my life and leadership were not extensions of the Bishop name, and that the empire I had built existed entirely outside the framework he believed he still controlled. His expression shifted, as if the ground beneath him had tilted, and he demanded to know how I could abandon the loyalty I owed the family. I told him the truth. Loyalty without respect is obedience, and I had stopped living under that arrangement years ago. The silence that followed cracked something between us that could never be repaired. I walked out before he gathered the nerve to respond, returned to my office, and closed the door with a sense of finality that no apology or demand could undo. The confrontation didn't drain me, it clarified everything. The work ahead was immense, the investigation was deepening, and the fractures were becoming visible, but for the first time, nothing pulled me backward. The collision that had been building for years had finally happened, and I was the only one left standing on the right side of it. The day the board approved the full release of the investigation felt like the world inhaled at once the kind of collective breath that marks the moment before a truth finally breaks into the open. And as I walked through the lobby, surrounded by the hum of reporters gathering outside, I felt a steadiness running through me deeper than anything my past had ever shaken. The official statement went out at 9 a.m, sharp every detail of the fraud, every layer of the misconduct, every point of failure left behind by the old leadership laid out with a clarity that didn't bend for anyone's comfort. I watched the newsroom react in real time. People standing taller, talking faster, understanding exactly what had been happening beneath their feet for years. And when the anchor who had spent the last week whispering about me was publicly named in the documents, his carefully constructed facade collapsed in a matter of minutes. Legal escorted him out through a side entrance to avoid cameras, but even from the 15th floor I could feel the shift ripple across the building like a storm finally releasing its pressure. Employees who had once avoided eye contact with me now met my gaze as if they had found something solid to hold on to. The corridors were filled with a kind of energy that didn't depend on fear or hierarchy. It came from relief from witnessing accountability in an industry that had gone numb from the lack of it. While they processed the news, my phone buzzed relentlessly. Board members acknowledging the decisive outcome, journalists requesting statements I had no intention of giving, and messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly resurfacing as if they had always been waiting in my corner. And buried among them were dozens of texts from my family, each more frantic than the last, asking me to clarify, to coordinate, to present a united front. I ignored every single one. They had spent years dismissing my work as insignificant thinking. My quiet meant stagnation, believing my independence was immaturity rather than strategy. Now that the world recognized the scale of what I had built, they weren't reaching out to understand. I could feel it in the tone of every message they were reaching for relevance. I didn't answer because the truth didn't need my defense. It stood exactly where it needed to, publicly, unmistakably, and without them. Around midday, Amanda brought me a printout of the network's early financial projections after the release. The numbers were already shifting upward, stability returning faster than any analyst expected. She pointed out that advertiser confidence had doubled within hours, that viewership across digital platforms had surged following the transparency announcement, and that employee retention metrics spiked for the first time in 3 years. I listened quietly, taking in the confirmation of everything I had worked toward in the shadows, and for the first time since the acquisition became public, I felt something like ease settle behind my ribs. Not triumph, not vindication. Something deeper, peace earned, not given. As the afternoon stretched on, I stepped into the newsroom for the first time since the announcement. The entire floor fell into a hush, not out of fear, but out of awareness. And as I walked through the aisles, faces turned toward me with expressions that carried a weight I hadn't expected: respect. A senior editor approached first, telling me she hadn't seen morale this strong since her early career. A young journalist said he finally believed the place had a future. An administrative assistant began to cry as she thanked me for bringing light into rooms that had been dark for too long. Their words didn't inflate me, they anchored me. They reminded me why I had built all of this in the first place. Not for the headlines, not for status, but for the work and the people whose careers had been hanging on a thread long before I arrived. And in those moments, I felt the last remnants of my family's old judgment fall away. Their voices, once so loud inside my head, had faded into nothing but distant echoes of expectations that were never mine to carry. As the day neared its end, I returned to my office and closed the door behind me, letting the quiet wrap around everything that had happened. My reflection in the window didn't look like the girl they once pitied at holiday dinners, nor the woman they assumed lived small because she lacked the ambition they valued. What stared back was someone I had fought to become someone who built her own shape, her own pace, her own world. I knew the road ahead would still be complicated, that power never came without resistance, that the past didn't disappear just because I stopped letting it steer me. But for the first time, I felt completely aligned with the life I was living. No disguises, no shrinking, not abiding by standards I never agreed to. Just the truth standing in full view, impossible to rewrite. And as I shut down my computer, gathered my coat, and stepped toward the elevator, I felt a quiet rise in my chest, a reminder that every story I had ever written, every risk I had ever taken, every moment I stayed silent while they laughed, had led exactly